Hey everybody, this is Rafe and Jeff, and this is episode 41 of Have Not Seen This, a weekly in-depth look at a much-beloved movie, selected specifically by our guest, that they're a little surprised when they find out people have not seen. Hope everyone is doing well out there. Regular listeners will be happy to know I'm back on the wagon, or off the wagon, or whatever the metaphor is. I'm back to watching some movies again. Last weekend, I watched 3 movies for upcoming episodes of the podcast, so I'll be getting my library of upcoming episodes built back up again, as well as a couple other movies that aren't for the podcast that I just want to spend a quick second talking about. Of course, the big one that just about everybody was watching last weekend was Hamilton, which came to Disney Plus, a filmed version of the stage play that was filmed back when it was the original cast, and I've been a Hamilton fan for a really long time. I remember hearing NPR talking about the unlikely success of this musical and getting the soundtrack for as a Christmas present from, I think, my dad, and just being absolutely blown away by what I heard. And so I've lived and breathed that cast album for several years now, but not gotten the chance to see the stage play. My dad, I should add, did get to see the stage play, that lucky son of a bitch. And it's phenomenal to see what that production is like and be able to sit in your living room and watch that. And I cannot rave about that presentation and what Lin-Manuel Miranda did with that creation enough. You know, I found it almost rather fitting that I was watching it on the 4th of July in a time that we're having to deal with racial inequality and issues that still exist surrounding that, to watch a production of a moment in American history being portrayed by a multicultural cast. There's just something about that felt right. But the music, the performances, it's all amazing. If you haven't gotten Disney Plus yet, I highly recommend it. It's definitely worth checking it out. Of course, The Mandalorian is on there and is fantastic too. But Hamilton is totally worth getting Disney Plus, if just for the free trial period, so you can check it out. Also checked out The Vast of Night, which is streaming on Amazon, which is also a fantastic film, and it is one of those movies that has suffered because of theaters being closed, so it ended up coming out on streaming instead of going to any theaters. But it also may have benefited from that because it's a small independent type film. It's very clearly a low budget movie, but I don't want to go into much about what the film is about, but it is also quite fantastic and worth checking out. If you love the old Twilight Zone, Outer Limits kind of feel, this is that in a 90-minute format. But it doesn't feel like it's in a 90-minute format. It goes pretty quickly, and one of the things I absolutely loved about it, I am a sucker for long single shots that let the actors really play the scene up and puts that power in the actors' hands, and there are several really extended long camera takes in this, including one on the young actress in it that's like 9 minutes long as she's doing some tasks, but you're getting a lot of characterization through that. So I highly recommend checking out The Vast of Night. I'll also give a shout out to Double Edge Double Bill. You know, I've had their hosts on my show, and I've been on that podcast a couple of times. Their episode this week talks about The Vast of Night, and I agree with a lot of the things that they talk about with it. So if you have seen The Vast of Night and want to hear an interesting conversation about it, go check out their podcast. If you haven't seen it and you have Amazon, I highly recommend The Vast of Night as well. The other thing I wanted to chat about before I get into the show is something I've been meaning to talk about on and off for the last, 30 some episodes, and that is Letterboxd. A lot of the other podcasters that I listen to have Letterboxd accounts set up, and I set one up way back in like episode 10 or 11 and then didn't talk about it and then promptly put it down, but I'm trying to get back into entering movies on that. So if you want to follow me on Letterboxd, I could use some friends there. I'm there as Taln Hess, that's TALNHESS, which is my username on Twitter and everywhere else as well. But really having fun going through and seeing what some of my friends have rated movies, because you always have that difference of opinion with some people, and you can look at a movie that you absolutely love and go, wait, how did you only give this 3 stars? So if you keep track of your movies through Letterboxd, go add me as a friend. Again, Taln Hess. looking back at last week's movie, which was the Warcraft adaptation, had a really good time talking about that movie, and I had planned for the Friday Inquiry question to be about video game adaptations on the big screen, because we know we have seen quite a few of those, and we know they tend not to be very good. But then a conversation kind of broke out between me and past guest Alex Kunka, who was, Luke's brother, who Luke was on the show last week. And we started talking about comments I had made about Ben Foster and what an impressive actor Ben Foster is. And so instead, I turned the conversation that direction. And so last week's Friday Inquiry, which I ask on social media each week, was, what is your favorite Ben Foster performance? A lot of former guests and friends chiming in with their opinions, and you'll see a trend here really quickly with the answers. Thomas Mariani said, gotta be the 3:10 to Yuma remake, one of the best modern Western villains of the 21st century. Adam Thomas said either Alpha Dog, 30 Days of Night, or Hell or High Water. Brian Ward and Chris Eklund both chimed in with 3:10 to Yuma. Tina Blankenship said his role in 30 Days of Night is so memorable, but I need some more films with him in the lead role. Hostage was good too. Price Ash said Charlie Prince in 3:10 to Yuma. He's an incredible actor. Chris Talent over on Twitter said 3:10 to Yuma. James Rodriguez, leave it to James Rodriguez, who introduced me to the movie Boy. Leave it to James to bring up another movie that I don't think I've really heard of and nobody else is talking about. He said, Leave No Trace, a quiet performance which says so much. Alex Kunka said 3:10 to Yuma, loyal, scary, good with a gun. And Old Man Alski said Pandorum, but chimed in with responses to Kunka and Chris saying, I got to check out 3:10 to Yuma. So there's kind of this universal, everybody loves him in 3:10 to Yuma, which I absolutely admit he's phenomenal in that movie. It's been a long time since I've seen it, and I probably need to revisit it again because I remember really liking it and specifically really liking him. We talked about Pandorum last week. I haven't seen that. Obviously, Leave No Trace I haven't seen, since I just made a big deal about that. And I have to admit, I haven't seen 30 Days of Night, so I'm missing some of Ben Foster's filmography from my viewing experience. But I love him in 3:10 to Yuma. Alpha Dog, he was quite good in. Hell or High Water, I absolutely love him in. I think that was a fantastic movie. And I got to agree with Tina. Hostage was good, too. It's not a brilliant movie, but his performance in it is pretty good. So again, each week on Fridays, I try to post a question related to that week's movie. On Twitter, we're at Have Not Seen This. On Facebook, we're at Have Not Seen This Podcast. Join the community, chime in with your answers to each week's Friday Inquiry. This week, we're turning to a new genre that we haven't really tackled on this show before, and that is the Western. And it comes from a very unlikely source to be tackling a Western, and that is my friend Jeff Mohr, who I used to co-host the Gruesome Magazine podcast with back when I started getting back into podcasting a couple of years ago. I was with them for like 6-8 months, and each week we would look at new horror movie releases. And so I know Jeff is a horror guy, but he decided to bring a Western to the show instead, and that is 1970s Monte Walsh. Now, don't confuse that with the 2003 Tom Selleck version of Monte Walsh, like I did, which is something we'll discuss on the podcast. But Jeff and I have talked about doing this movie for several months, and unfortunately I made a mistake that caused us to delay talking about it. And then, of course, as I said last week, I kind of shut down on watching new movies for a while. But I'm back in it now, and our conversation about Monte Walsh is a lot of fun. We do talk about the 2003 version as well, but most of our focus is on the 1970 version of Monte Walsh. So here we go with our conversation with Jeff Mohr from Gruesome Magazine. So how you been?
Good. How about yourself? I saw you. Congratulations on your new certification or recertification or relicensing or whatever.
Yeah, thanks. I don't know that it's going to lead to a job as fast as I would like, but it's a step in the right direction at least.
Open doors.
So my understanding is it's pretty much a requirement of podcasts these days that I have to ask, how's your quarantine going? So how have you been doing through all of quarantine?
Pretty good. I mean, I'm retired, so I don't have to go too many places. About the only time I leave the house is for groceries. Went to a couple of Little League baseball games before they canceled the season. But other than that, doing pretty good. Doing all the stuff we're supposed to. because we're old folks.
I kind of wish you lived closer to me, because watching, your posts pop up on my Facebook timeline, or whatever they call it these days, you're really
Mhm.
keeping in touch with developments, and kind of translating the news or the double speak that's coming from government or that kind of stuff. I mean, you really seem like you're dedicated to making sure information is getting out there to your friends and is understandable.
Yeah, well, I do have a little bit better than average understanding of math and statistics, but the problem is our governor has a website designed to give the appearance of being transparent while not being transparent. So you got to dig. You really got to dig and look at stuff hard and try to figure out what are they hiding and why are they hiding it. So
Yeah. Well, and as I said, I mean, I kind of wish you lived nearer to me, so I was getting that information, as relevant to my own area, because you're really on top of things.
well, I appreciate that. Just trying to spread information. I usually don't do bashing stuff. I usually just post information. I've given up on certain things. I don't pretend anymore, but for the most part, just trying to provide information.
Cool. So, of course, I know you, from doing the Gruesome Magazine podcast with you. So I've always known you as a horror person. And I know you do several podcasts over there that are horror related. Is horror your primary genre, or are you more eclectic than I thought? Because you didn't pick a horror movie for the show.
No, I didn't. So I grew up, my dad was a big Western fan. So I grew up seeing Westerns, and that was, if they took us to a movie, 90% chance, my parents, if they took us to a movie, it was a 90% chance it was going to be a Western or a musical. My mom was a music teacher. So those were the two options. But I loved horror because I'd come home from school and there was a movie on at 4:00 in the afternoon on weekdays. And they would have various topic weeks. So there'd be like science fiction week and horror week and monster week and stuff like that. And those I love. So I saw all those 50s and early 60s monster creature features, alien invasion, all those things. And that's what really got me going. I had no support in loving horror from my parents because they were totally anti. They wouldn't let me watch The Twilight Zone when I was a kid, and I was there when it was live, So the minute it started playing in reruns, I started watching it. So it maybe that was it, because it was seen as a forbidden fruit. And over the years, I had intermittent amount of time to delve into horror, depending on family and that kind of stuff. But the last 10 years or so, I'd say, the job that I had, I was driving all over the state of Iowa and started to find podcasts. And then there was more and more movies available streaming. And that's when I really dived back into it. So trying to cover a lot of ground now over the last 5 to 10 years. Also, I'm a big fan of film noir from the 40s and 50s.
Ooh.
But mostly horror. I'd say, 80% of the stuff I watch is horror.
Gotcha. Well, I certainly enjoyed getting to talk horror movies with you when I was a part of Gruesome Magazine, and something popped up on my Facebook feed like yesterday, where I guess it was a movie we had covered and I hadn't watched in time for the show, but I watched it because you recommended it, because the post was a poster for the movie, and my comment that when I posted it was, when Jeff Mohr recommends a movie, he knows what the hell he's talking about.
No, yeah, I think we were searching. We were just missing a movie, and we were searching for it. And I just happened to find that on, I don't even remember what it was on, Netflix or Amazon. And I think was it Caliber?
It was, yes.
Yeah. I had to talk until it popped up to the surface. But we'll see about this one.
Well, and that was part of the fun of doing that podcast, was every week was we'll see what.
Yes. And they have, it's too bad because we've developed more contacts over the last, 2.5 years. So now we're getting better movies. So not as many of the lower echelon, I guess.
Gotcha. So the podcast is called Have Not Seen This, where we talk about movies, we're surprised people haven't seen, or movies we're passionate about that we wish other people have seen. What are your Have Not Seen This movies? What are movies that people are surprised when they find out you haven't seen?
Well, there's there's actually a lot of horror movies that I haven't seen in the 80s and 90s. I'm not a big franchise guy. So I'm trying to think if there's any. I've seen all the Halloween movies, but when it comes to Friday the 13th and Nightmare on Elm Street, I'm trying to think of any other ones right off the top of my head. But I see like the first couple, and then it's sort of like been there, done that. I'll go back and watch them when I want to, but I'm looking to be scared and surprised, and they become less surprising and more a caricature of themselves, it seems like. So, some of those later movies in the franchise type flicks and horror.
Yeah. No, and that's actually one of the things I've always liked about the Nightmare on Elm Street movies is it felt like the farther they got, the more they just kind of embraced becoming a caricature of what they were. Like they really embraced kind of the corniness of it. But surprise, one of those have not seen this moments. I've never seen a Friday the 13th movie. Not a single one of them.
Oh, there you go. I watched the first one, and I believe I watched the second one, but I haven't. Well, I did watch whichever one takes place in space. I think that's like number 10, maybe, just because somebody said it was a hoot. So I watched it, and it was. But, yeah. So those are the main ones. Otherwise, most big horror movies, because I really did kind of miss the 80s and the 90s with my kids growing up and working and that kind of stuff. Even though there was video stores, I didn't rent the low rent stuff because I don't know. I was my parents' child, I guess. Didn't want to expose my kids to that. But anyway, now I do. Now I watch them with my grandson.
My kid is 11, and I'm deciding how can I start introducing him to horror as a genre without spending too many nights with him having nightmares or damaging his psyche or anything like that. It's a tricky road to walk.
It is, and it's hard. This one grandson we watched, Insidious, I think it was the first one. And I remember thinking, oh, it's not that bad, it's not. Oh. And I'm thinking gore and sex, but scared the shit out of him. And he said, and there was one point where he jumped up and ran out.
Yeah, I'm sure.
and afterwards I said, that was an error in judgment, wasn't it? We shouldn't have watched that. Oh no, it was great. So I don't know. He is still a horror fan, and he's 16 now. So.
Yeah, that one's a little more psychological than gore or sex, but yeah, I totally, I can see where that mistake would be made.
I wasn't thinking clearly.
All right, well, let's turn our focus to Monte Walsh, which is your pick for this week, which is not a horror movie, but a Western.
It is not. It is a Western.
Directed by William A. Fraker, written by Lucas Heller and David Zelig Goodman, based on the novel by Jack Schaefer, starring Lee Marvin, Jean Moreau, Jack Palance, Mitchell Ryan, and Jim Davis.
Monte Walsh, cowboy, born in 1843, died when he had to. Don't ask if he was real, because he was as real as the West.
We couldn't get work. A lot of good boys can't get work. If I was starving, I couldn't rustle.
Well, you ain't. You're getting your 3 squares every day. It ain't like we was rustling many better we know.
Makes no difference. They belong to Slash Y.
Slash Y? Stop flatting about something that ain't anymore. The kind of life you're talking about is dead. Snow buried it last winter.
It ain't dead. As long as there's one cowboy taking care of one cow, it ain't dead.
Dumb egg-sucking.
Nobody gets to be a cowboy forever.
There's gonna be a place for us, a place where we belong, to stand outside just looking in has got to be all wrong.
So the question I always start with is, how do you describe this movie to someone who has not seen it? Because, this is Westerns. I don't think, in fact, I had never even heard of this movie until you introduced me to it. When I think classic Westerns, I think like, The Searchers or True Grit or, classic like John Wayne type stuff. So how do you introduce this movie to someone who hasn't seen it?
I guess I tell people that it's sort of a grand vision of the end of the cowboy life, told in sort of in an episodic format, establishing really, that's pretty much it, And I also go big on the Lee Marvin and Jack Palance thing because they're great in this, I think. But the cinematography is great. This is one of those movies I love everything about. So I got to stop talking right now. So.
No. So why, out of all the movies that are out there, especially if you're going to leave the horror genre and go to Westerns, why was this your choice?
Well, mainly because a lot of people haven't heard about it. It wasn't a big blockbuster. And I think it's a really good movie. So I tell people about it all the time. If I make a top 10 of my movies through history, this one always goes on it. And I just think about movies that I've watched the most times. And I can't tell you how many times I watched this. I own the VHS, I own the DVD, and I now own a Kino Lorber Blu-ray.
Wow. Meanwhile, I had to scrape together to find a copy. So what is your history with this movie? Like, when did you first see it? I
first saw this in the theater. I went to see it in the theater with a friend of mine.
Wow.
And loved it. I'm old. I was not quite graduated from high school when this came out.
I always forget you're a little older than I think you are.
I just act young. I act immature.
What made you fall in love with this movie?
I'm just going to say I love everything about it. When I go through, it's one of those things where I went to this movie and I thought, this is a great movie. And then when I start looking at the people that are in it, they have done tons of other great movies that I loved. So I think it's sort of the things where all the pieces fit together to make something greater than the whole. I love the starting, the music is by John Barry, who is an Oscar winner. The Cass Elliot sang the theme song, the intro song. The director, though this was his first directing role, William Fraker, he has 6 Oscar nominations for cinematography, which you could tell by the movie that a cinematographer directed this movie, or there's a good cinematographer involved. And I think that the actual cinematographer in this film was somebody who was a sort of lead camera operator for Fraker when he was DP or cinematographer. So the music just fits perfectly. I love these little episodic things that kind of build up we start off with a scene of Jack Palance and Lee Marvin as Monte Walsh and his buddy Chet Rollins hunting wolf for pelts. And that starts to develop that sort of bond because they're jabbing each other back and forth, right? Then they ride back into town to join up with the ranch that they've always worked for and find out it's no longer around now. They've got to go work for another ranch that's owned by a big corporation, and there's fewer people there, and the town is starting to die. There's these sort of scenes that are designed, I think, to give the feel of what it was like to live there. And I like it because it's realistic. When they're sitting in the bunkhouse eating, there's no spare room in there, or in the what do you want to call it? Dining room. There's no spare room. Yeah. You can't walk around the guys while they're eating. And that's the way stuff was then. Yeah. The mess hall. Yeah. So the bunkhouse is ratty looking mattresses and slat boards and stained pillows and stuff like that. I mean, I just feel like that's realistic. Lots of dust in this movie. So it wasn't like clean cowboys, you know, it wasn't like they were covered with dust, their hair grew, their sideburns got bushy, you know, their beards grew till they got into town, you know, every few months or something. So I don't know, for me, I just love the feel of it. It's very nostalgic for me. Sort of a cap off of all the Westerns that came before it as to you know, what happened to that way of life.
And it's interesting you mentioned that about what happened to that way of life, because this comes out in 1970. Several other Westerns around that same time period are kind of doing the same thing, looking at the death of the cowboy lifestyle. And it's also kind of marking the cinematic end of the age of Westerns. Why do you think that became such a fixation for Hollywood at the time period?
I don't really know, except those things go in cycles. So back then, 50s and 60s, when TV was kicking in, there were a ton of Westerns on in the 50s and 60s. I mean, you couldn't hardly, there was Westerns on multiple channels in every time slot, I think. Then you get up to late 60s and the 70s, and they kind of turn into detective shows. You know, not very many Westerns at all on television. And I just think that that's sort of, I don't know if it's because they wear it out. I don't know if it's a time gone past, because, you know, some Westerns you can get the feel that, oh, it would have been great to live that way. But when you really think about it, you know, it really sucked, you know, like here I'm sitting in my air conditioned house with my internet and my big TV and all that stuff. And they're, you know, that's another thing that I liked about this is in a lot of the movie, they're sweaty and dirty, you know, because that's the way it would have been.
Yeah.
So why did that stuff die out? I think it just kind of runs its course. I think there's a romance going on. You had this major star like John Wayne that was almost, you know, you could throw the whole genre on his shoulders and keep it running through the 60s. And there wasn't, and his is also one of those last ones. The Shootist is another one of my favorites. The last film that John Wayne made before he died. And I think that's later 70s, a little bit later anyway. I never really thought about it, so I'm just shooting my mouth off.
Oh, no, it's all good, man. So again, I hadn't heard of the movie until you brought it up, you know, as a film for the show. It is popular. It sits at 88% at Rotten Tomatoes. As usual, I pulled in a positive and a negative review just to kind of give us some discussion points. Again, they kind of hit on some things that I liked or didn't like about it, although probably not so much true about the negative one. The positive review comes from Roger Ebert, even in 1970. He wrote, "The Wild Bunch and The Professionals, each in its own way, were about the shortage of work for gunslingers. They suggested that violence had gone out of style in the West, that a gun on the hip was no longer needed in polite society. The Wild Bunch seemed to seek death almost suicidally in the last half of that great movie. They'd lived by the gun and they had to die by it. Ironically, because they knew no other way to make a living. Monte Walsh is set at the same psychological moment in the West, but it takes a quieter and on the whole more thoughtful approach. There's a fair amount of gunplay, yes, and Marvin has a well-staged action scene where he tries to tame a bronco and succeeds in destroying half a town. But mostly the movie sticks close to ordinary life, to the camaraderie of the bunkhouse and the range, to the everyday life of the working cowboy, and to the shy and beautiful love between the cowboy and the prostitute. This movie is rough, but it is almost always tender." So before I move to the negative, any thoughts on what Ebert says?
Yeah, I think that's a good description, and that fits a lot of what I think about it. I was sort of paying a little more attention to the structure, and I'd say you're about halfway into the movie before something drastic happens. Up until then, it's just these tender moments, right, of how they get along, how they're living together. Some of the guys get laid off, but then we also see on what do they do, you know, as the cowboys are dying. We see one guy gets married to the hardware widow. One guy joins a couple of the guys to rob banks and rustle cattle. Another guy goes and I don't know exactly what he's doing. He's sweeping up a shop somewhere or roadhouse just to have someplace to stay warm and eat.
I think he's working at the railroad station.
Oh, maybe that's it. Maybe that was it. but there's not a lot of people in this movie outside the cowboys and a couple of bar scenes.
Yeah. All right. Well, let me bring in the negative review. You've already said so many things I want to talk about, but just in the fairness of equality here, the negative review comes from Tony Mastriani from the Cleveland Press. And he wrote, Monte Walsh had possibilities that never were realized. It has the appropriate unprettied scenery, the ramshackle town with muddy streets, the bare, bleak saloon, the dusty, gritty working conditions, the soiled, grimy bunkhouse. The men are bearded and grubby. The women look drawn and tired. It tries so hard to be honest that it finally gets very pretentious and dull. It's as though someone forgot that atmosphere wasn't enough, that there has to be a story. And then, because the filmmakers realized it was dull, they livened it up with cliches from more conventional westerns. There's a saloon fight and a bunkhouse brawl and a chase and even a final gun down. The last low-key and unconvincing.
I could see, So if the fact that this is based on a Jack Schaefer book somewhat belies the idea that they decided it was too dull and threw this other stuff in. That stuff is in the book. The one thing I noticed watching it this time, though, was, and maybe it's because I'm getting older and I've watched so many more movies over the last few years, but Lee Marvin has like a dozen sort of zinger lines that can sound pretty cliched unless I'm in the right mood. Sometimes I think they sound great, but he's always just saying, the guy that's riding wire and is known as Joe Hooker, riding his horse down, and they're going, he's not going to make it. He don't want to make it. That those are the lines. He's got those, like he has the response line for everything. That's sort of the shut everybody up line. This is the final quote or the final statement.
Right. So I guess it sounds like you're saying whether it comes across as cliched or entertaining is really kind of dependent upon what mood you're in when you're watching it?
Yeah, I think maybe it's how long it's been since I saw the movie. I watched it, I don't know when we started talking about doing this, a month or so ago, maybe. So now I've just watched it again. I frequently watch it.
That was 3 months ago.
Oh, was it 3 months ago? All right. So I don't know. Most of the time I love it. I love Lee Martin. Today it rang a little cliched, and that may be the first time it's done that for me. I could see that as a criticism by some people.
Now, have you read the Jack Schaefer novel that it's based upon?
I did, and actually, my memory of it is that it's a lot like the movie, in that it's a series of, I don't know, kind of like Stephen King's The Gunslinger. The original Gunslinger was I think maybe 5 novellas that were sold separately and then put together as a book. These are like sort of separate little vignettes or scenes almost that are put together into a book. It's not like this started and then they did this and then they did that and then it's just sort of these things that are happening to them, and you get an idea of what's going on. It's been a long time, and I've been thinking now since we were going to do this that I should go back and reread it.
Well, the reason I ask is because my understanding from some of the research I did on the movie is that it's very loosely based on the book. It's not necessarily very true to the book. But, and you know this, but for the listener's sake, part of the reason it's been several months since we first started talking about this is I sat down and watched this a couple of months ago, but I watched the wrong version. There was a remake made for TV with Tom Selleck and a really all-star cast. And that's the version I watched. But a lot of those lines that you're talking about that Lee Marvin has, kind of those buttons to the ends of scenes or those comebacks, are present in the made for TV adaptation as well. So it's almost as if this isn't true to the book, then neither is the TV adaptation, which is then another question of why did they bother remaking this?
Yeah, I wondered about that. I kind of wondered if maybe this wasn't like one of Tom Selleck's favorites and he wanted to do it or some, I don't know why they did it. To me, it's one of those, for me, it's like, why remake the perfect movie unless you're trying to get it more exposure in some way. But I really dislike the Tom Selleck version. And I know a lot of it is the same, but it just doesn't work for me. And I don't know if it's because Tom Selleck's not Lee Marvin, or Keith Carradine isn't Jack Palance. They're both good actors in their own right, doing their own thing. But I don't know. I'm Lee Marvin and Jack Palance and Jim Davis. Those guys are so fixated in that movie for me.
No, and I think you've hit it on the head there, because when I was, again, my introduction, because of my mistake, my introduction was the Tom Selleck version. And when I was watching this, there's a lot more heart to Lee Marvin's performance than Tom Selleck has in his version. And I buy this silver-haired Lee Marvin as an aging cowboy a lot more than I bought Tom Selleck as it. And also the rapport between Lee Marvin and Jack Palance, I even wrote down in my notes that they feel like these playful bros as opposed to two cowboys towards the end of their tenure. There's something about them that they're playful with each other. You can tell that they've had each other's backs for a really long time, and that just shows up on the screen.
I agree completely. And I do really need to go back and look at the book, because my memory of the book is it's pretty long, and I don't remember being, like disappointed and going, well, this isn't anything like it, or they really screwed this up when they did the movie. But I also think, in a movie, you can't, if you got a 400-page book, how much of that's going to be in the movie? It's definitely longer than Shane, because I think it's sort of this collection of, it's almost like a collection of short stories about the same characters. At least that's my memory of it.
Well, and I love that you keep coming back to that, because that's how you said, when I said, how do you introduce someone to this movie, that you brought that up from the beginning, that it is like a collection of vignettes. And I wish I had known that going into it, because I was looking for a movie with an overarching plot and a beginning, a middle, and an end. And I think telling people up front that this is a series of vignettes, it's essentially short stories about the character put together with an overall theme, is a much better way of selling the movie.
I failed you.
No. But I think someone who hears this and knows that going into the movie will have a better experience watching it. And I knew that's the way it was when I started up the proper version, the Lee Marvin version. And so I'd like to say that impacted how I was a lot more entertained this time. But I also just think it has to do with, this was a better movie, that the 1970 version, there's just real heart to it in places that feel lacking. Now there were some changes that I almost liked the Tom Selleck version, like Shorty. That there's a background between our main characters and Shorty in the Tom Selleck version that isn't there.
Yeah. When
we first meet Shorty in this version, it's when he's doing the shooting practice and they're shooting the stuff out from before he can get to it, which I found it changes the relationship, and I liked that. But then when Shorty gets fired and they give him the money, it feels a little weird in this version, because that relationship isn't the same, if that makes any sense.
Well, maybe to a certain extent. To me, all the background we really need to know is these guys know each other from somewhere, and that he's sort of the hotshot, brash one that they kind of poke fun at. And that comes across pretty quickly with that shooting scene.
Yeah.
And I did just notice something. I was looking at the new version, or the 2003 version with Tom Selleck, and the teleplay, co-writer on the teleplay is Robert Parker. And Tom Selleck did a bunch of TV movies based on Robert Parker books about a character. I forget I think his name might be Stone or something, but he's like a ex-drunk cop who becomes a police chief in some small coastal town in the Northeast. And then the stories are, typical Robert Parker, Spencer type stories, only a different character. So there's a connection between them is what I'm getting at. And so I don't know, it'd be interesting to me to know what started the idea.
Yeah, I mean, it would be interesting. I don't know that I'm that interested in pursuing it, because I mean, it's funny because that Tom Selleck version has a ridiculously talented cast. I mean, you've got, as you pointed out, it's Tom Selleck, Keith Carradine. You've got Wallace Shawn shows up at one point. I mean, it's a hellacious cast and some great Western style actors.
Yeah, Barry Corbin, Isabella Rossellini. Yeah.
Oh yeah, Barry Corbin, James Gammon. I mean, you've got some fantastic actors in there, but it just doesn't come together the way that this version does. And so I'm kind of going to be happy to just pretend that 2003 version doesn't exist from now on, because I liked this version.
Well, that's kind of the way I watched it again, because I hated it when I watched it when it was on TV, because I'm sort of excited to see it. And that was the beginning of my disillusionment with Tom Selleck, I think. But this one also, the original from 1970, has a great list of Western character actors too, that you might not be aware of if you haven't seen a lot of stuff from that era. But almost all those guys were in lots and lots of TV and movies. Westerns. I mean, you mentioned Jim Davis, Mitchell Ryan, and then the guys that played the side characters, G.D. Spradlin, Michael Conrad, who ended up being the precinct sergeant in Hill Street Blues.
Oh,
Bo Hopkins, right? So lots of well-known guys in there.
Yeah, see, I'm just not that familiar with Westerns as a whole. It's definitely a shortcoming in my movie knowledge. So I kind of wondered about that. Like, were these, those kinds of actors from 1970? And I just don't get it because, I know, heck, my introduction to Jack Palance was Batman and then City Slickers. I didn't know his varied career until within the last 10 years.
And there's another one of my loves for Jack Palance is he's in some really great film noirs, as is Lee Marvin in the 50s. Lee Marvin played some really despicable characters in some film noirs. But I was going to bring up this character, Matt Clark, who plays Rufus Brady.
Yeah.
The guy that gets shot in the crick.
Yeah.
He's a pretty recognizable guy during that era. I believe Outlaw Josie Wales. I knew he was in Outlaw Josie Wales, but he's in a lot of other stuff during that time. And then the guy that played the doctor is also very recognizable, at least to me.
Yeah, he stood out to me.
Sort of tending to Martine after she died.
Hey, Jen.
Hey, Micah.
Remember watching the Friends premiere?
No, I never saw that.
Oh, but remember those first Wu-Tang solo albums that came out?
No, I don't.
Remember that terrible Frasier theme song?
Oh my god. Remember I was sent away from home when I was 16, sent to the middle of nowhere, Montana, therapeutic boarding school. None of this rings a bell?
Oh, yeah.
Join us for I Never Saw That, a podcast about mid-90s pop culture and Montana.
What about ER? You saw that though, right?
No!
So let's talk a little bit about Monty and Martine's relationship, or as he calls her, the Countess, because it's not a prominent part of the story, but yet it's kind of an important part of the story, I think, because he's almost willing to give up the cowboy lifestyle for her in some ways. He's trying,
And that's that dilemma is, we're always, we go through it all the time, right? People complain about change. The Walmarts come in and the mom and pops are starting to go out, or before it was the malls come in and the mom and pops are going out, and now the Walmarts are killing the malls, and it goes. You can think of all kinds of stuff, and it's change, and it isn't going to stay that way. It's gonna change again, and so I think that's what it was like for them. That's the way they had lived, and for him, being a cowboy was what he was. That's how he identified himself. So for him to do something else was outside of his thinking. So his relationship with Martine was, I'm a cowboy, so I won't be getting married. Where on the other hand, his buddy Chet sees the writing on the wall and starts thinking about it. Plus, I guess there's an opportunity there with the hardware widow, as they call her, who is another character who's in movies. I'm pretty sure she's in, isn't she in Jeremiah Johnson, the the crazy woman out in the plains that he gets the boy from?
I don't know the movie, so I wouldn't be able to tell you.
Oh, you haven't seen Jeremiah Johnson?
No, I told you I'm not very well versed in westerns at all.
Now that's another one with not a lot of dialogue. Because this one too, that's one of the things too I like about this is there's a lot of. We talked about this a lot on the podcast. There's a lot of, we don't want too much telling, too much talking, talk, right? And this one has a lot of showing, not telling. There's a lot of, most of the conversations are pretty short, and there's a lot of stuff you learn just by what they're showing you. Nobody says, "Oh, damn, Shorty killed a U.S. Marshal."
That's true.
They just roll him over and pull the shirt back, and there it is, and then everybody runs away, and oh, he's screwed. They don't spend time talking about it.
That's true. And if you weren't paying attention when they make that revelation, then you wouldn't understand why everybody's freaking out, because they don't really talk about it that much, other than later Monty does say, Sugar will testify that you didn't know he was a marshal. But if you weren't paying attention, and yeah, you and I used to talk about that all the time, the importance of that show, don't tell, keep the audience engaged. And I definitely think this movie does that.
Yeah, it does. And it is typical Western with all the grandeur shots of the plains with the mountains in the background, but it's beautiful. It really is.
Yeah, and I kept looking at those shots, wondering if we would be able to pull off those kinds of shots today, or if we as a society or a civilization have marred those landscapes too much at this point.
Well, I know you can still find them, because we don't have, a shot like that. If you find the right angle, there could be a city just over the rise, and you don't see it. But I don't know. I do really like the feel of it. I mean, it even starts with that. They're cowboys. What do you do in the winter? You have to, I guess you go out and trap or hunt wolf or something to get pelts to earn some money and have food for yourself. And then you go back you show up when it's time for another herd and do it all over again.
Yeah. Well, jumping back to the relationship, I really felt like probably one of my favorite moments in the movie is when they're having that serious conversation about their relationship. And this is after, his buddy has gotten married, and he asks her, "How come we didn't get married?" And her response is, "You never asked me to." And that it could have just been that quick bump back and forth, but then it becomes an almost heartfelt conversation about it, where both of them seem really touched at the notion that their relationship could go that direction, although there's almost like this underlying fear in Monty's face about where things could go.
Yeah. No, I think he knows can't do that, and he's trying to talk himself into it, as what it feels like to me. And she's wanting to believe, right? But even then, when he backs off just a little bit, and you start to find out what a stretch it would be, and you could tell that he's feeling really bad about it, that she kind of goes back to her, that she's resigned to that's what the relationship is going to be, and she comforts him.
Yeah, but it is resignation,
right.
As you said. I mean, there's like an underlying heartbreak,
Mm-hmm.
and I mean, when he gets the opportunity to take the job with the traveling roadshow, and tells her about it, and then tells her that he's not taking it, and she has that line about, "Well, I didn't think this would be tomorrow," type thing, but you can sense her disappointment in it, even though that's the face she's putting on.
Right. That's exactly right. That's another one that I think she's an incredible actress, and I haven't seen a lot of stuff that she's in, but she is a very well-known French actress, and she and Lee Marvin together make those scenes really powerful.
Yeah. I mean, I think the relationship between them, while it's not a central focus of the movie, really is an important one in exploring just how much the cowboy life means to Monty.
Yeah. And again, I love that connection. I love her. She's a prostitute, But this little shack that she lives in, it's like decorated to the hilt, the original one, with fancy like wallpaper. I'm thinking it's even like gold and green.
Yeah.
Just everything in there is nice and kind of fancy, it seems like, right? She's really dressed it up. But when she's forced to move to Charlieville, that's all gone by the wayside. And she's on a minimal subsistence, marginal subsistence.
Well, but has it? Because the doctor even comments that, just even through it all, even when she was deteriorating in health, she had that really ornate jewelry box, which held her prized treasures. And of course, we see that it includes the money that Monty gave her, which means she never relied on the money that he gave her, and a clipping of his hair. But that to me is almost as important as how decorated her shack was.
It is. She saved that piece, but where she's living now is a bare bones room. Assuming that where we see her, where she died, that was her room. And I think it is because Monty walks right to it.
Yeah, I mean, I assumed it was. And I found that was another really interesting angle to take the story, though, is that not only is this the death of the cowboy, but it's the death of other professions that might depend on the cowboy. And I mean, her statement about being a prostitute, that you can't stay in one place because business becomes, I don't even remember what the line was, but the idea being that business is going to dry up if you stay in the same place because people aren't moving on.
Right. I was thinking about that even in terms of the hardware store. Chet married into the hardware store, but that town is dying. How long is that hardware store going to be there? It seems to me they don't really talk too much about that town, the original town, Harmony, but it seems to me to be a town that's basically there to serve the ranchers in the area and their help. Now, there may be some other business, but we don't get a good picture of that. There's a hardware store, there's a barber shop, there's a bar, but it seems to be dying, right? Because the ranches are dying. So I kind of assume that's where most of the reason they were there.
Yeah, no, that was kind of my assumption as well. I mean, we learn even as early as, like 10 minutes into the movie when Monty and Chet return from being out in the wild, all the ranches are essentially gone. They've all been bought up by this consolidated company. And by the end of the movie, the consolidated company just wants to fence off the land so that it's protected and theirs, but they're not going to do anything with it.
Well, you might start purchasing and breeding cattle, but you don't need anybody to herd them. You don't need anybody to do a roundup and drive them somewhere. You've got the railroad now. Anyway, yeah. And that strikes me now, too, as we were talking, that, Chet is a guy who is watching what's going on around him and thinking about it and trying to think ahead a little bit. Monty is the guy that he's just living day to day doing what you do without really thinking about it. Even when they ride into town that first time and Mr. Brennan tells them about these ranches going down, he wants to talk. I want to talk to you guys. And Monty's like, nah, he just wants to get in and have a drink, play some cards. He don't want to think about his future,
Right.
So,
right.
Whereas Chet's the one that's come on over. Yeah. And trying to talk. Yeah.
So both reviews brought up the bronc busting scene, which is significantly more elaborate and destructive in the 1970 version than the Tom Selleck version. What are your thoughts on that scene?
Okay. So I'm assuming that it's like, from the time he gets on the horse to the time when he walks it back to the corral, I think is between 3 and 4 minutes. Now, the odds of that being able to carry on for that long, I think it's like the old barroom fights they used to have in old Westerns that, they lasted forever, and it just wouldn't happen that way. But I love it. I absolutely love it. It's like the perfect symbol or metaphor for the end of the Cowboys. He rides the last unrideable horse, and maybe in that way it's a little heavy-handed, but I still loved it. I absolutely loved it.
Yeah, I enjoyed it. I do think it's a little hyperbolic, but I enjoyed watching it. I mean, I think you're right. It's kind of like a last hurrah. It's Monty's dedication to this task, once he sets his mind on it, he's going to break this Bronc. That's it. He's going to break it, or it's going to kill him, which there are several moments in that you almost think that's the direction that are going to take it. I almost take issue with him telling Shorty about it later on, because, they have their final gunfight and he shoots Shorty, and that's like his final words to Shorty is, I finally rode that Bronc.
Mm-hmm.
And it almost feels like a fuck you at his death,
Well,
like
it's
killing him wasn't enough. By the way, I accomplished what you couldn't.
Well, it's an odd relationship. It's sort of like they're friends, even though they were somewhat adversaries, even when they were cowboys at the same place. But they were friends, and they'd known each other for a while, and even they disapproved of Shorty hanging with these other two guys. And when they found out that he'd robbed a bank and that that Rufus had robbed a bank and Shorty had killed this marshal, they're telling Shorty what he needs to do to get his life turned around. They're trying to get him to turn himself in and tell the truth about what happened. And he didn't know he was a marshal. But then they finally, he's not going to do that. So they tell him to go south, and try to get a job and save some money. And then when he rides off, they see the other two yahoos ride up. And they get this sad look on their faces, this is not going to go. So I think, despite their sort of rivalry and their mutual competition, maybe, that it was sort of like, I got to kill you because you killed Chet. But we still kind of have this bond as having been cowboys together. That's the way I took it. I didn't take it as a in-your-face thing.
Yeah, and it's not delivered as an in-your-face thing, but it's just how it felt to me. But I totally, I mean, I think you're right. That's the way it should be interpreted, is, we're still buds. I mean, he's not happy about having to face off against Shorty. He's not happy that events have gone this way. Obviously, he's more upset about Chet's death than having to face off against someone he considered a friend. But yeah, I mean, I think you're right in the way that it's supposed to be interpreted. And, I'm just an asshole.
But it is kind of an in-your-face thing. In that final scene too, when and everything is happening so fast, right? I mean, I don't know what the time is between when he rides the Bronc and he finds out that Shorty killed Chet. I don't know what the time is. If that's he writes back and finds out when he gets back.
It's not long.
Yeah, because the next scene is he goes back and talks to Martine and says, I can't do this. I can't, spit on my whole life kind of thing, even though it'd be $30 a week plus expenses. And then the next, I think literally like the next scene is when Chet gets shot, and then we see them. Are you going to go to the funeral? No, he's going to take off after Shorty. And I forget the point I was trying to make. But he's there. He finds out about Martine's death, and he's there grieving, and Shorty shouts up. And from that point on, when they start that scene, there's something about, I kind of mentioned the music as being by John Barry. I love the music in this. It has this kind of grandiose Western theme that plays that is kind of tender, but then the music they played during that scene where Monty's hunting Shorty, I thought was great. It built the tension for me, and there wasn't a lot to it. It was your basic sort of bass, low notes with some high things mixed in there. I know I probably shouldn't even try to describe it, but I just thought it was really good at setting the tone for that scene.
Yeah, no, I agree. The music, it didn't have me at first. I mean, it opens with, it's not quite a contemporary song, but it is a song sung by Mama Cass.
Yes.
And a lot of the theme music throughout the movie is just an instrumental version of that song. Mm-hmm. But you're right. When the music changes for that gunfight, it's a very severe change from the music for the rest of the movie. But man, it fits the tone of the scene. And really, I totally dug that part of the music.
Well, and I think too, it's a very unadorned sort of shootout. You don't really get a fast draw, right?
Yeah, no. Yeah. I mean, it's not stylistic at all.
So and for me too, another reason this is really interesting is that with John Barry doing the music for this, he also did the music for Midnight Cowboy, which came out a year before that, and that had kind of a haunting harmonica theme that you could kind of see a connection to this. I'm with you on the Mama Cass song. That's a little sappy for me. The lyrics for Hal David, I noticed, who was a popular songwriter of the era, or of the earlier era, I would say. But yeah, John Barry's cool.
All right, what have we not talked about that you'd like to talk about?
Well, first off, Jack Schaefer. Jack Schaefer's kind of an interesting character because he's legendary for Shane, right? I mean, at least that movie is legendary. And I always knew about the book. I bought the book from, Scholastic Book Services when I was a youngster in school and read it back then.
There's a throwback.
Yeah, so to me, it was a very famous, well-known book. But Monte Walsh is not a famous, well-known book, and neither is. There was one other movie based on one of his books called The Silver Whip that has one of my favorite guys, Rory Calhoun and Dale Robertson. So kind of a decent Western cast, but a really bad movie. Just a bad movie. So I think it's interesting. I love Shane, but I don't particularly care for The Silver Whip, and I love Monte Walsh, but he's just not well at that. He's basically one of those guys that he's known for Shane.
Right.
That's what everybody knows him for, at least in people that I know. Yeah, I had seen some trivia too that, you said Ebert gave it a good review. Ebert gave it 4 stars, but Gene Siskel gave it 1. So his is probably similar to the one you read. And I guess maybe the other thing that I don't know if we made a big enough deal about it, but William Fraker was the cinematographer for Bullet, Rosemary's Baby, and a long list of other very well-known movies. Some not so good. The Island of Dr. Moreau, although I don't think the cinematography is usually the knock on that one. Tombstone, right? So there's Tombstone is another one, and there's another grand Western, right? But also movies like Murphy's Romance with, I think that's Burt Reynolds and Sally Fields, and Sharky's Machine, that's another Burt Reynolds, I believe. The Exorcist 2, Looking for Mr. Goodbar, which is a very well-known movie of the 70s. Gator, another Burt Reynolds. He got hooked up with Burt Reynolds a lot. Paint Your Wagon. So yeah, this guy had a very successful career as a cinematographer. Not as much as a director, but as a cinematographer. And I think it shows.
Yeah. I mean, I think visually, cinematography has changed obviously between 1970 and today. So I definitely, there were scenes where I wondered how it would be shot today, but it is quite an interesting cinematic experience, especially for 1970. Like the guy knows where to put his camera and how to set up the shots. And some of them are quite wonderful because of that. And the one that stood out to me was the final charge of Joe Hooker, that you see him running, but between the cinematography and the editing, you don't have to worry that the horse was in any real danger, but yet it still feels that tragic moment of Hooker's last ride.
Right. And I thought about that, and the bronc busting ride too, where the editing and the camera angles are key to making it not too obvious when Lee Marvin's double was on the horse and when he wasn't. They actually did a pretty good job of that.
All right, well, let's head into the closing credits here. Got 2 quick little games for you. The first up is The Algorithm Says. These are movies selected by various algorithms that say, if you like Monte Walsh, you'll like these movies. So this is kind of a lightning round for responses for you. I'll tell you the movie. You tell me if you like it, you don't like it. Most of them I can totally see how they're connected to Monte Walsh, but in case if you're wondering what's up with the algorithm, you can always, posit that as well. But it's just quick responses to this list of movies.
Okay.
All right. So first up, The Spikes Gang.
I've never seen it.
Oh, okay. Prime Cut.
Oh, I don't think so. And I think that's there because of Lee Marvin.
Okay, interesting. All right, the Culpeper Cattle Company.
That's okay. Not as good as this, but that's okay.
All right, 7 Men from Now.
Haven't seen that one either.
I haven't seen any of these, so you're ahead of me already. Cat Ballou.
Yeah, Cat Ballou is a great movie, but it's I think the only real relationship is Lee Marvin again. It's a totally different movie.
Right.
But it's a fun film.
Pocket Money.
That kind of fits in there with Prime Cut. It's just kind of an odd film.
Yeah, I think the lack of exposure Monte Walsh has may be why the algorithm is really focused on an actor or director, that kind of thing.
Yeah. So Pocket Money is and the time period. I think Pocket Money is Paul Newman and Lee Marvin. And I was thinking, I always get those two. Strangely enough, I get that and Prime Cut mixed up, which is Lee Marvin and Gene Hackman.
Gotcha. Okay. All right, Rio Lobo.
I love Rio Lobo. I don't know why that's connected. Very well-made John Wayne movie. Actually, a remake of one of his earlier films, and I'll have a hard time thinking of what that is. But with Dean Martin and I believe Jimmy Caan is in that. The original had, in the Jimmy Caan role, the original was Ricky Nelson.
Okay.
And they both have John Wayne. I'll think of it here in a second. Because we have to say which one. It's a Rio Bravo. It's a remake of Rio Bravo.
Oh, okay. All right, that makes sense. All right, a little Tom Selleck in here for you. Quigley Down Under.
That's an okay film. If I liked it, if I watched it now, I probably wouldn't like it because that might be the beginning of his. He kind of went to this, to me, sort of this shrug, low voice. I don't know, version of acting, and I can't hardly stand to watch him anymore. He just kind of he gets a big sigh and says something, and I'm just like.
For me, the charm of Quigley Down Under is Alan Rickman. So because I'm never going to turn down Alan Rickman as a villain.
Okay. Well, there you go. I liked it when I saw it. I just haven't seen it for a long time.
All right, 2 more. Olzana's Raid.
I believe that's Burt Lancaster, and that is an okay movie.
All right, and the last one is Paint Your Wagon.
No. Oh my God, I hate that movie.
Really? Okay, interesting. I have never seen that one either, but I do have it in my DVD collection.
Well, let's take these two great actors, Clint Eastwood and Lee Marvin, and just kind of castrate them by making them sing, and they really can't. I don't know.
Yeah, I understand it's quite terrible. All right, we always end with a pop quiz, 4 multiple choice questions based on the movie. And based on a couple of things you've said, even in the last 10 minutes, I think you're going to do quite well on this. But if you're ready, here we'll go.
Okie doke.
Number 1, Roger Ebert gave the movie a 4-star review. How did his Chicago rival / partner, noted critic Gene Siskel, differ from Ebert with his review? A, 1 star, B, 2 stars, C, 3 stars, or D, 4 stars?
1 star. And I want to point out, you did not send me these questions ahead of time.
Yeah, you got that one right. I mean, you said it like 5 minutes ago. I'm sitting here going, okay, well, there's that question. No, I don't send the questions ahead of time. What joy would there be in that? Number 2, Lee Marvin, a creature of vice, was banned from which of his habits while filming Monte Walsh? A, smoking, B, drinking, C, womanizing, or D, gambling?
I'm going to say drinking.
Yep, he was specifically banned from drinking while they were filming the movie, although based on an excerpt from a book about Marvin that I was looking through last night, it doesn't sound like they were successful in getting him to stop.
I'm guessing he's pretty resourceful.
All right, number 3, the movie is loosely based on the novel of the same name by Jack Schaefer. It seems interesting they would option the novel but stray from the story, especially after another movie had found so much success based on which Schaefer novel? A, Mavericks, B, Old Ramon, C, The Plainsman, or D, Shane?
Well, Shane, of course.
Yep, absolutely. Of course, Shane was just recently kind of in my awareness because, it's in the AFI Top 100 list, which one of the podcasts I listened to was talking about. Which again, I find it interesting that Shane would be so popular and this one wouldn't be. I don't know. I'm happy you introduced me to this movie.
And incidentally, Jack Palance is in Shane as well.
Right.
He's the gunslinger that Shane shoots.
Right. Yeah. All right. Last question. Number 4. Despite coming far into the career of Lee Marvin, this movie marks what is pretty universally agreed upon as a first for the actor in a movie. What was this an on-screen first for? A, referencing an outhouse. B, not shooting at a target. C, shooting a love scene. Or D, appearing with Jack Palance.
I'm going to say appearing with Jack Palance.
No, he had done several other movies with Jack Palance already prior to this. Okay. This was his first love scene.
Oh, holy cow.
Still, 3 out of 4, not bad for our pop quiz.
Now, that probably wasn't a love scene. Just a short story. The first nude scene I ever saw in a movie was a sort of neo-noir film called Point Blank, starring Lee Marvin and Angie Dickinson. And Angie Dickinson is changing in the lit bathroom and Lee Marvin standing out in the dark hotel room. And so you see the silhouette of Angie Dickinson nude. That's the first nude scene I ever saw.
I'm astonished you can remember that. I can't think of the first nude scene I saw in a movie.
Well, they were fewer and far between back then.
All right, Jeff, where can people find you? What do you want to promote? I know you've got several podcasts to talk about.
Well, go to gruesomemagazine.com, and we've got a group of podcasts called Decades of Horror, and we cover like everything up through 1989. There's a Decades of Horror 1980s, Decades of Horror 1970s, and Decades of Horror the classic era, and each one of those comes out every 2 weeks. And then I'm also on the Gruesome Magazine podcast, where we review a couple of new to streaming or video on demand movies, and that we are in the process of going video on these.
I saw that.
So you could catch the Gruesome Magazine podcasts are on our YouTube channel. And 1970s, we did a video. We have to wait for some software upgrades before we do the other two. But anyway, it's lots of fun. I felt like I was out in the middle of nowhere, Iowa, with no one around to talk horror with until I found these guys, and now I've got plenty of people to talk to about these movies.
Well, and you're a great voice to have on the show. As I said, I really always enjoyed talking movies with you, even when we didn't agree on the final verdict of a film. One of the things I enjoyed talking with you about is I feel like you're very respectful about other film critics and their opinions, and you're willing to listen to other opinions. And that doesn't happen that often in our film critique community, unfortunately. So many people go in with the attitude of, I'm right and here's why. And you go in with the attitude of, this is my opinion, but I'm willing to hear yours. And that's, I think, a very valuable trait.
Well, I appreciate that. But my feeling is that our opinions and our views, especially of this, I mean, we're talking about art on whatever level it's at, that my opinions and feelings about it are based on my entire life's experiences. And so I'm going to like stuff that you're not going to like. You're going to like stuff I'm not going to like. And I've had people ask me questions, why do you like that? And I might have a hard time answering it. It just, what I usually say is it resonates. It just resonates with me, something about my experience, but I could watch this movie. Motel Hell is one of those, which a lot of people don't like. But I that just resonates with me.
It's a bit of a far cry from Monte Walsh.
It is. But I appreciate you saying that, and I enjoyed doing that with you as well. And I always got insights that I didn't think of. So I missed that.
Yeah. Well, thank you so much for coming on the show and introducing me to this movie. And good luck out there with Gruesome Magazine. And I hope to chat movies with you more in the future.
That would be great. Thank you.
So that does it for this week, but you can keep the conversation going throughout the week on social media. Share your thoughts about Monte Walsh, or maybe tell me about a movie you'd like to come on the show and talk about. You can find me at TalnHess on Twitter and also on Letterboxd. That's TalnHess. You can find the show at Have Not Seen This on Twitter. On Facebook, we're at Have Not Seen This Podcast. And of course, you can always email me at havenotseenthis@gmail.com. And of course, don't forget to subscribe to the show so you don't miss any of our upcoming episodes, including next week, which takes place in an Antarctic outpost where not everyone is exactly what he seems. This podcast is available through all major podcast sources. Positive ratings and reviews are always welcome, as is sharing the podcast with a friend and spreading the love. And if you like World of Warcraft or other Blizzard Entertainment games, be sure to check out my other podcast, Citizens of Azeroth, a World of Warcraft podcast, also available through all major podcast sources. Special thanks to Chris Talent for our wonderful theme song, and thanks to Jeff Mohr for providing this week's conversation. Until next week, I'm Rafe Telsch, and this has been Have Not Seen This. Be kind to each other.